October 14th, 1943. Across the mist-covered airfields of England, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses of the U.S. Army Air Forces ignite their engines. The thunder of metal fills the cold morning air. Their target, the city of Schweinfurt in central Germany, home to the ball-bearing factories, the beating heart of the Nazi war machine.
Sound, warning sirens, aircraft wheels rolling down the runway. From the air bases of East Anglia and the Midlands, nearly 300 flying fortresses take off. They belong to the 1st and 3rd Bombardment Divisions of the 8th Air Force, tasked with conducting daylight precision bombing deep inside enemy territory. Narration. Command believed that if they could destroy the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the German war industry would grind to a halt. Tanks would not roll, aircraft would not fly, and guns would stop firing. But to reach Schweinfurt, these bombers had to cross more than 1,000 kilometers of enemy airspace through layers of flak and fighter intercepts from the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force. Transition sound, radio chatter, wind howling, engine roar. Deep commanding voice. 8th Air Force to all groups. Maintain formation, target Schweinfurt. Godspeed. Massive bomber formations take shape in the morning sky. 30 aircraft form a combat box, a defensive pattern where each plane covers the others with its guns. From the ground, the sky above eastern England looks like a moving steel swarm. 6:30 a.m., the bombers head east toward the North Sea. The sun rises slowly, glinting off their silver fuselages. Inside the cockpits, the temperature hovers just above freezing, and the higher they climb, the colder it gets. Most of these pilots and crews are barely in their 20s. They know the odds of survival are less than 50%. But orders are orders. They trust in two things: the strength of their flying fortress and the promise from their fighter escort, the P-47 T-7 Thunderbolts, that they will protect the big friends as long as possible. Sound, synchronized engine roar, tempo rising slightly. As they leave the English coast, the bomber stream is joined by squadrons of P-47 escorts. But by the time they reach Aachen, near the German border, the Thunderbolts must turn back. Their range is too short. From here on, the bombers will be alone. Deep inside the Reich. 8:30 a.m. German radar stations pick up the massive formation approaching the Rhineland. Alarms echo across the airfields. Feindliche Bomber, Höhe 7,000 meter. Enemy bombers, altitude 7,000 meters.
From air bases at Frankfurt, Kassel, and Nuremberg, waves of Messerschmitt, Bf 109s, and Focke-Wulf FWs 190s scramble into the sky. Over 300 German fighters prepare to intercept. The flak batteries open fire. The sky erupts with black bursts, 88mm shells exploding at 20,000 feet. Shrapnel rains down like metallic hail. The Americans hold tight formation. Separation means death. Flak heavy. Altitude 23,000. Hold formation. A B-17 takes a direct hit. Flames engulf the fuselage. It spirals down, trailing smoke. No parachutes open. The others fly on, eyes fixed ahead. No one can stop. 10:45 a.m. After more than 4 hours in the air, the bombers approach Schweinfurt, a gray industrial city in the heart of Germany. It houses 6 major ball-bearing factories, including SKF Kugelfabrik, which alone produces over half of Germany's bearings. But the city is also one of the most heavily defended in Europe. Flak towers ring its perimeter, 88mm, 105mm, and 20mm guns firing in deadly harmony. Each B-17 carries over 10 50 caliber machine guns, capable of firing 13,000 rounds per minute in total. The air becomes a storm of steel. Smoke and fire twist together above the city. A crewman later recalled, "The sky wasn't sky anymore. It was a furnace made of steel." At 24,000 feet, the bomb doors open. Tons of explosives fall toward the factories below. The Kugelfabrik plant disappears in a sea of flames. But as the bombs strike their targets, the real nightmare begins. The way home. On the return flight, the bomber stream thins out. Fuel tanks are leaking. Engines are failing. Each crippled fortress drifts out of formation and becomes prey for the circling Messerschmitts. Bandits 6 o'clock high. Break! Break! German fighters dive out of the sun, cannons blazing. Tracer rounds rip through aluminum skins. American gunners fire back, some scoring kills. But many never get the chance. Flaming bombers spiral downward. Others explode mid-air. It is a scene that history would remember as Black Thursday. By the time the surviving bombers cross the German-Belgian border, only about 200 remain airborne. When they finally reach England, just 198 B-17s land safely out of nearly 300 that departed. More than 600 airmen are missing or dead. October 14th, 1943. The bloodiest day in the history of the 8th Air Force. A terrible price for the belief that a flying fortress could truly be invincible. In the aftermath of Black Thursday, U.S. commanders halted deep penetration raids into Germany. They had learned a grim truth. No fortress is impregnable. To win the air war, they would need something else. A fighter with the range to go all the way. The P-51 Mustang, but that would come later. The consequence of one day that changed the air war forever. 11 a.m. on October 14th, 1943, what unfolded over central Germany was no longer just a bombing mission. It was a massacre in the sky. At 23,000 feet, the air was thin and freezing, but the heavens burned. Anti-aircraft fire from below, Luftwaffe fighters from above and all sides, and the U.S. 8th Air Force's flying fortresses, each a 16-ton hulk of steel, were locked in a deadly ballet of fire and smoke. From German airfields at Würzburg, Kassel, and Frankfurt, more than 400 Bf 109s and WWIIs climbed to intercept. They attacked in waves, using the tactic of head-on, fire, breakaway. The fighters screamed toward the bomber boxes from 12 o'clock high, closing at nearly 800 km/h, unleashing 20mm cannon shells that tore through the sky. Each hit spelled catastrophe. A single round could rip open the cockpit, ignite a fuel tank, or shear off an entire tail section. Tail section gone. We're hit. We're hit. They're coming head-on. Oh, God. Within minutes, 5 B-17s had been destroyed. Fragments of burning metal tumbled through the crystal-clear air. Tiny parachutes dotted the horizon, some opening, some not. Inside each B-17 flying fortress, 10 men fought in deafening chaos. In the nose compartment, the pilot and navigator struggled to keep formation. Amidships, the top turret gunner and waist gunners fired endlessly, the smell of gunpowder thick in the cold air. Beneath them, sealed in a glass bubble, crouched the ball turret gunner. A man curled into a sphere of plexiglass and aluminum, suspended between earth and heaven. A veteran later recalled, "We were flying through hell. The sound of the guns, the rattle of metal, the smell of smoke and blood. That was the sound of Black Thursday. Engines failed. Hydraulics bled dry. Some pilots ordered their men to bail out, but many stayed because a crewmate was wounded, because they feared capture, or simply because they could not leave each other behind." Amid the chaos, on a slightly higher altitude, a handful of P-47 Thunderbolts still circled, stretching their fuel to the limit, refusing to abandon the bombers. One American pilot wrote later in his diary, "I saw a B-17 on fire, engine R3 out. They were falling behind. I knew if I left them, they'd die, so I turned back. Many did the same. They had no fuel to return to England, yet they dove into the fight anyway. Several Thunderbolts were shot down or ditched in the Channel when their tanks ran dry, but thanks to them, hundreds of flying fortresses survived the death corridor of the Rhineland. 11:30 a.m. The surviving bombers reached Schweinfurt. Below them, the industrial city was swallowed in black smoke. The Kugelfischer plant, the primary target, was ablaze, its assembly lines destroyed, the ground trembling from the blasts. But there was no time to celebrate. The Luftwaffe regrouped, launching a second wave against the retreating bombers. Some aircraft took hits to their fuel tanks. Flames swept across the wings, turning the silver fortresses into fiery comets. Crewmen fought to control the crippled planes, dragging the wounded to the hatches. Some never made it. Only seconds separated life from death. By early afternoon, the German sky was filled with smoke and falling parachutes. From the ground, civilians watched in horror, a rain of burning metal and human figures descending through the haze. In less than 20 minutes, over 30 B-17s were destroyed. Those who survived saw their comrades vanish in fireballs before their eyes. A U.S. Air Force officer later wrote, "We hit the target, but the price was the blood of an entire generation." As dusk approached, the remaining bombers turned west toward the English Channel. Their radios crackled with exhaustion and despair. Engine 3 out, fuel low, we're losing altitude. Some fortresses crash-landed in neutral Switzerland. Others went down over the French countryside. A few barely reached the English coast, collapsing on impact. By 5 p.m., only 198 B-17s landed back in England. Nearly 20% of the attacking force was lost. 605 airmen were dead or missing. When the survivors finally touched down on England's damp runways, the sun was already setting. Ground crews counted the returning aircraft in silence. Inside the mess halls, men sat staring at empty chairs, at the spaces where friends had sat that morning. One officer recorded in his journal, "That night, nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. We all understood. We had lived through Black Thursday." October 15th, 1943. One day after Black Thursday, at the rain-soaked airfields of eastern England, silence replaced the thunder of engines. Across the runways, the surviving B-17 flying fortresses stood battered and broken. Some were missing engine cowlings. Others had wings torn and riddled with holes. But what haunted everyone most were the empty seats in the mess hall. Empty chairs, untouched trays of food, the names erased from duty boards in chalk. Yesterday they had been laughing together. Today they were gone. That afternoon at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, received the final after-action report. The figures were merciless. 291 B-17s launched, 198 returned, 60 shot down, 17 written off beyond repair, 605 men killed or missing, 43 captured, a loss rate of nearly 20%. Unsustainable by any measure. Eaker closed the folder and sat in silence. Later he wrote in his memoirs, "I looked at the names of the dead and asked myself if victory could ever justify this price." After the 2 Schweinfurt raids, one in August, one in October, the U.S. Army Air Forces came to a painful realization. Flying fortresses could not protect themselves deep inside Germany. Since early 1943, the doctrine of daylight precision bombing had been America's pride. It was believed that tight formations of B-17s, bristling with machine guns, could punch through any defense. But the skies over Schweinfurt proved that theory wrong. when the P-47 Thunderbolt escorts turned back. Due to limited range, the bomber stream became helpless against the swarming Luftwaffe. A surviving pilot said, "We watched the P-47s peel off for home, and then the German sky fell on us. Without escort, the fortresses were flying targets." The October raid forced U.S. commanders to suspend all deep penetration daylight missions for nearly 5 months. In Washington, the War Department and Army Air Forces convened emergency meetings. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the entire U.S. Air Force, ordered a full investigation. He wrote in his report, "We can build more planes, but we cannot replace the men who fly them. There must be a way to protect them." Across the Atlantic, British Royal Air Force commanders echoed the same warning. They had long argued that unescorted daylight bombing was suicide. Now the Americans understood it in blood. The answer to the air war's deadliest equation came in the form of a sleek new fighter, the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally designed for the British, the Mustang became a legend once fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It combined speed, altitude, and endurance like no other aircraft of the war. With drop tanks attached, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way from England to Berlin and back, a feat no P-47 or P-38 could match. By late 1943, the first P-51 units began arriving in England. They flew high above the bomber formations, diving down like thunder when German fighters appeared. American crews called them affectionately "Little Friends." A B-17 gunner later said, "When we saw the Mustangs overhead, we knew we had a chance. Every time the radio crackled, 'Little Friends overhead,' the whole crew cheered." By early 1944, with the Mustang in service, the U.S. resumed full-scale daylight raids. The bombers no longer flew alone. The sky itself had changed. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Big Week. Massive coordinated strikes against Germany's aircraft industry. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced enemy fighters over its own homeland. The results were devastating. In just a few months, over 2,600 German fighters were destroyed, along with hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. From that point on, the Luftwaffe never regained air superiority. What had begun as a disaster at Schweinfurt had become the foundation of Allied victory. Seen through the lens of history, October 14, 1943, was not just a failure. It was a turning point, a brutal but necessary awakening to the limits of machines and the worth of human life. From the wreckage over Schweinfurt rose a new strategy, one forged in sacrifice, one that understood that technology means nothing without humanity. Those who fell that day did not die in vain. Their loss forced change. Their courage gave birth to innovation, and from their ashes, victory was built. 6 months after Black Thursday, the flying fortresses returned to German skies, this time under the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang. Across the blue sky, white contrails crossed like signatures of a redemption. It was the dawn of a new era in air warfare, one paid for by the lives lost over Schweinfurt. Wars may end with silence, but for those who fought in them, they never truly stop. After Black Thursday, hundreds returned to England with bodies scarred and souls shattered. The men who survived the Schweinfurt mission carried in their eyes the haunted look of those who had flown through hell. At Thorpe Abbott's airfield, home of the 100th Bomb Group, the atmosphere was unnervingly quiet. Mechanics worked silently, patching holes in aircraft skins the size of fists. Inside the hangars, chalkboards listed crew rosters. Next to many names were red slashes. marks of those who would never return. One witness recalled, that night, in the mess hall, no one said a word. We just stared at the empty seats. Every sound was swallowed by silence. For these men, war was no longer glory. It was mathematics of survival. 10 men take off, 8 don't come back, 2 live. Tomorrow 10 more will fly again. Not everyone died in the flames. Roughly 43 American airmen were captured after parachuting into enemy territory. They were marched through angry German towns, past the smoking ruins their bombs had caused. To the civilians, they weren't heroes. They were the enemy. Sergeant Robert Wilson, one of the captured, later wrote, "When they caught me, a woman tore the patch off my shoulder and screamed, 'You killed my husband.' I couldn't answer. I just thought, war turns us all into monsters." The prisoners were sent to Stalag Luft III, a camp for Allied airmen. Men who once flew among the clouds now lived behind barbed wire, watching snow fall through iron bars. Even in captivity, they held on to a ritual. Every night, before sleeping, they read aloud the names of the comrades who had fallen. When the war finally ended in 1945, the survivors returned home, believing peace would bring rest. But for many, the war continued, in their dreams. The sound of engines in the night made them flinch. The smell of aviation fuel brought back burning planes. Many suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition not yet named at the time. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, a former B-17 pilot, wrote in his journal, "Every time I close my eyes, I see it. Parachutes drifting, black smoke, the sound of the 88s. I keep asking why they died, and I lived." Some veterans chose silence. Among them was James Howell, the P-47 pilot who had stayed behind to defend a crippled bomber until his fuel ran out. After the war, Howell returned to New Jersey, bought a small farm, and lived quietly. When neighbors asked about the Distinguished Service Cross hanging on his wall, he would simply smile and say, "I just did what anyone would have done." His story, the man who refused to leave his comrades, became legend. An act beyond orders. An act of brotherhood. It was that spirit, selfless, steadfast, human, that defined the airmen of the 8th Air Force. For the people of Schweinfurt, Black Thursday was also unforgettable. Civilians remembered the day the sky itself fell. The Kugelfischer factory lay in ruins. More than 400 civilians were killed, and thousands were left homeless. A German engineer later recalled, "We knew they would come again." And that day, no one truly believed Germany could win anymore. The devastation forced the Nazi government to scatter its industry, moving factories into mountains and underground bunkers, a desperate and costly measure that crippled productivity. Historians would later conclude, Black Thursday was a tactical defeat for America, but a long-term strategic blow to Germany. By the 1980s, as the airmen grew old, filmmakers and historians began to seek them out. They recorded their memories, their voices cracking with age, but still sharp with remembrance. From those fragments, the full picture of Black Thursday emerged again. In 1989, the documentary The 100th Bomb Group, The Bloody 100th, premiered, featuring interviews with the men who had lived it. The camera lingered on wrinkled faces, but in their eyes still burned the light of 20-year-olds who once flew over Germany. One veteran said, "We weren't heroes. The heroes are the ones who didn't come back." Today, at air museums in Britain and America, you can still see the names and tail numbers of the bombers that flew that day. Every October, the few remaining survivors gather for a small memorial. They don't say much. They just look up at the sky. The same sky where their friends still fly, in memory, in wind, in history. Black Thursday is not only a chapter of war. It is a testament to courage and to the price humanity pays to understand its limits. As General Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, every airman who flew over Germany in 1943 knew he might never return, but he flew anyway because freedom needs wings. October 1943. World War II had reached its fiercest point. Across Europe, the Nazi war machine still dominated the continent. In the east, the Red Army was locked in bloody combat. In the west, the Allies struggled to find a way to cripple Germany's industrial heart. The raid on Schweinfurt, the day history would call Black Thursday, was a tragedy written in fire, yet it became a turning point in the war for the skies. Historians now agree. Without Black Thursday, the U.S. Air Force might never have changed the way it fought. Before that day, American commanders believed completely in the myth of the flying fortress, a bomber so heavily armed it could fight its way to any target. But Schweinfurt proved that even steel has limits. 60 bombers down, more than 600 men gone. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a revelation. An intelligence officer later wrote, "You cannot win wars with machines alone if you forget the men who sit inside them." From that moment, strategy shifted. The 8th Air Force no longer saw air combat as a battle of machines, but as a struggle of endurance, of men, of hearts, of survival. In 1944, the P-51 Mustang changed everything. With long-range tanks and the power of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back again. The result was a new kind of sky, one where bombers and fighters moved as a single, living organism. Operations like Big Week in February 1944, the Berlin raids in March, and the Normandy air offensive in June all owed their success to that transformation. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now faced Allied fighters above its own cities. Between February and May 1944, Germany lost more than 2,600 aircraft and hundreds of its veteran pilots. The tide had turned. What began as disaster over Schweinfurt became the foundation for victory. After the war, Schweinfurt stood in ruins, its factories reduced to twisted iron, its people shattered. But from the ashes, a new city rose. When Allied forces entered in 1945, they found the Kugelfischer factory a shell of rubble. Yet within a decade, it was rebuilt, producing ball bearings once again, this time for peace, not for war. Today, if you walk through Schweinfurt, you'll see a small stone monument that reads, "Hier fiel der Himmel brennend." Here, the sky once burned. It does not speak of revenge or glory. It speaks of memory and the cost of forgetting. Across eastern England, the old bases of the 8th Air Force still rest among green fields. Thorpe Abbotts, Bassingbourn, Horham. The runways are cracked, the hangars rusting. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the hum of engines carried on the wind. Faded paint on the walls still reads, "Home alive, boys." Each year, veterans gather there. Gray-haired men who were once 20. They sit together, not to boast, but to remember. They speak the names of friends who never returned. At one reunion in 1993, an old pilot said softly, "Every time I hear a Pratt & Whitney engine start, I think of them. 10 men to a crew, 10 stories, and one promise, never forget." Black Thursday is no longer just a date in a history book. It is a living lesson, a testament to courage and to the limits of technology. Military academies still study the Schweinfurt Raid as an example of strategic misjudgment that forced innovation. Filmmakers, writers, and historians return to it again and again. To the image of the B-17, the gloved hands gripping the yoke, the radio crackling with life and fear. A British historian once wrote, "Black Thursday was a defeat from which victory was born. Sometimes humanity must pass through hell to find the right path." May 1945. The war in Europe ended. The Nazi Empire collapsed. The sky over Europe was blue again. No sirens, no smoke, no thunder of guns. But if you listen carefully, somewhere in that endless sky, you can still hear the echo of October 14th, 1943. The roar of engines, the cry, "Bandits, 6 o'clock high." The whispered prayer over the radio, and the silence that followed. 80 years later, technology has changed. The world has changed. But the meaning of sacrifice has not. Those young men, barely 20, flew not for fame or medals, but for a simple belief that freedom must always have someone willing to defend it. October 14th, 1943. More than 2,000 airmen flew into history. 600 of them never came home. But because of them, the skies of Europe were free again. As the sun sets over the fields of England, we remember them, the men who fell through the clouds so that generations after could live beneath a peaceful sky.